All right, guys, thank you so much for being part of 24 Hours of Chaos. We are very excited to talk to you guys about you giving us some great tips and tricks on the do's and don'ts of virtual productions, specifically virtual productions in LED stages and where we can go there. We've got two fantastic people to help us with this information. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Zach Alexander. He is the president of Lux Machina Consulting Group, which is part of NEP Group. And we are joined by Barbara Ford Grant, president of Prism Stages, also part of NEP Group. And you guys remember Barbara was on the CG Garage on episode number 372 back in April of 2022. And we're excited to have her here. And I'm sure, Zachary, you are going to definitely be a guest on the CG Garage in the near future. But for now, we've got this very short and exciting presentation to talk about the do's and don'ts of virtual production with LED stages. So I want to kick it off with some of the stuff that you guys told me about. So the first one is don't use it for everything. Be mindful of when it makes sense. So what does that mean?
Well, I think it means a lot of things. I think from my corner of the world, it's understanding when you're using a 2D solution, so like playback, versus a full 3D rendered solution and things like that. And at least from more of a technical side of things, and I think Barbara can definitely speak to kind of like the VFX aspects of it a little bit more. But like from my side of the world, it's understanding that the jump from 2D to 3D, you're gaining parallax that's being caught in camera, right? So you're seeing perspective change, and it's understanding when parallax is like super visible, like if you're close to something and you're moving around it, versus, objects that are, 30, 40 feet in the distance that for your whole scene, it moves, the camera moves 2 inches to the left and right, understanding that the difference between those two types of technologies, while they look very similar on a set, can have huge differences in both scale of complexity and honestly cost. So that's one of the things I look at.
Yeah, I mean, it works really well for a lot of things, and for some things, it depending on the size and the shape of the volume and the quality of the volume, the technology supporting it, it may or may not be the right tool for everything, right? I mean, obviously, if you're doing massive sets or sweeping shots or lots of stunts and action going on in the foreground, maybe it's not the right space to do it in, but there may be portions of that kind of work that make a lot of sense on the volume, and maybe parts of it go to a VFX pad or go to post-production in other ways. And so, we always like to say it's not for everything, but it's also good to know exactly how you're going to use it ahead of time, in the same way that you plan for what you're going to physically do or what you're going to do in post-production.
Worth also noting that, like in real-time playback, you don't have the luxury of a theoretical infinite amount of time to process a frame of content, since you're doing it in real time. So being keenly aware of the limitations of a real time render engine is super key. So like things that have millions of polygons that you're trying to move all at once in a scene or things like that might be better for a post process than trying to capture it in camera.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, understanding the limits of what can happen and run at rate is very important on this stage. And also thinking and planning in the way that you would for any kind of visual effects work, for what needs to be super high res, what's going to be close to the camera versus what can kind of cheat your way further into the background.
But you mentioned there are 2D solutions for things that don't necessarily need a lot of parallax, right? Which comes back to basically your projection in a sense.
With reflections.
With reflections.
Yeah, no, I mean, the funny thing about all of this, I think, is that like this version of virtual production we're doing is actually kind of a conglomeration of the virtual production that existed before, right? Where you're doing like facial capture, you're gathering data to make your post workflow look more realistic. But then it's also coupling all these old school special effects techniques. I mean, we're talking, rear screen projection, translights, all that type of stuff.
So Trumbull days, yeah.
Like there's a whole, I think you look at stuff like The Mandalorian or like big LED volumes and you think it's either this or nothing. And the reality is that this flavor of it is, there's actually a huge gamut. So just understanding where you lie on that range is really what you're trying to just be mindful of. I think it sort of goes into the first question where like, the first question is, should I use this, or what's the cool things I can do? And then usually the second question is, well, how much is it going to cost me to do, right? And so from like a practical standpoint, all the hardware and the LED with this, they're all sort of like Lego blocks, right? You can build them as big or as small as, quite frankly, your budget allows. So from the keeping in mind how your shots are framed from like a logistics point of view, you need more LED if you have wider shots that are further away and you need to fill the whole frame with LED. If your entire environment is a whole bunch of practical set pieces with little spots of, volume or virtual production kind of tools going on, that's a completely different scale of work. And so it's not just a cost thing, but it's understanding like, why are you using these tools in a particular scene and to like what effect?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like physical production, right? You have to kind of plan for what's going to be in camera. And if you don't, things can break or things are not there that you thought would be there when you move the camera. And, just like physical production, if you do something wider than what the environment was built for, it's not going to magically show up. Somebody's got to go and build it in a lot of cases unless you planned for it. So like the closer you can lock down tech viz of what's actually going to be shot on the volume, the more efficient it's all going to run. And also the better it's going to look in camera. Right.
Okay. This next question is something that's like, always every time for me. Do you understand your color pipeline? Color pipeline is always so complicated. But tell us what your thoughts are on color pipeline and LED walls.
I'll start this one and I'll let Zach jump in. I mean, color pipeline is a many wondrous thing, right? And it starts all the way from all the source art that's coming in to how it's going to be driven to the volume, how the volume's calibrated itself, and then where's that stuff going when it leaves? Yeah. What's the camera setup that it's being captured on? And so, we think it's really, really important. We're there to help, like I'm sure anyone in this business is, to understand the entire color workflow and to help manage that color pipeline for an entire loop, through the entire loop, not just into the volume, but knowing and planning for what you're going to do for color, everything from the assets to the camera to post-production is critical. Right. Obviously to happiness and to success.
Obviously, but it's interesting because you have obviously the color of what's on the actual set that you need to make sure that's in the frame space. And then you have the color of the camera that's capturing the entire process, right?
Yeah.
Right, well, and also the color in the material that's being driven, the actual pixels going to the volume itself.
Well, and also understanding, because it's not like in a perfect world you're coming straight from render engine to LED processor, but if you need to put in monitoring in place, which we often do, it's understanding if you're going to put things in line, what do they do to like, the bit depth and stuff like that. I mean, the amount of times I've been in a situation where someone said, well, I'm outputting 10-bit, and you follow the chain and you go, yeah, well, it's not making it past here. Like the LED wall can do that. This piece right here cannot. And so like understand that that's, a reality sometimes is super useful.
Right. Okay. Don't assume all LED volumes are equal. Well, that kind of makes sense, but let's get into the bottom of what that means. Like, what are the differences that we need to be aware of in terms of different LED volumes?
I think, when we think about virtual production, there's that enormous gamut between setting up an LED wall to like the fully enclosed volumes that we have at Trilith and like Stagecraft and others have. But even inside of that, and I'll hand it over to Zach to get into some of the details of all this. There's going to be different tile. There's going to be different 2D, 2.5D playback system. It might be Unreal in one place. It might be Unity in another situation. There are a lot of variables. It's not a sort of turnkey system. So it's good to know not only the color workflow, but exactly like what all the components are that you need for your project going into a volume and the shape of that volume, not just the size of it, but actually how it's shaped. If you're going to do, certain things with vehicles and you might want, a ceiling that wraps around that vehicle. There's a lot of different ways to go about to skin that cat. and Lux Machina, I think more than anyone, has seen the variety out there.
Yeah, well, and so like just on the shape itself, there's just the idea of coverage, right? And what you'll see is that like you know, on one end of the spectrum, the perfect one is just a perfect LED dome, right? Where like the sky is essentially replaced by LED, and then like I can look in any direction at any time, and the light can come in from any direction, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, you would have stuff that you'd see more like on a car process stage, right, where you have smaller screens that are right up against the windows to kind of where they go. But like again, you're kind of keeping in mind and understanding what the stage is designed to be able to do and how flexible it is and kind of the consequences of that, right? From like an LED point of view, you've got everything from the pixel pitch, which is, the distance between the LEDs themselves, which is feeds into your like resolution. You've got like bit depth of what the tile can support versus the processor versus the pipeline to the processor, which we're kind of mentioning in the color. We talk about color. And then there's even stuff where it's like the alignment of the RGB LEDs within each individual diode. If you want to go down a real rabbit hole, because and I'm just going to use this as an example to show you how far this goes down. But if you were to say, I don't know, walk up to a lit LED screen and put your face right up next to it, which I definitely have done more than once, you'll
Me
see,
too.
yeah, exactly. You'll see like the R, the G, and the B LED, right? And what's interesting is that usually they kind of are aligned in one of two ways. They're either in a line like this or they're in like a cluster. And if they're in a line, as you look at that LED wall, if you go like this direction, so I've got like my R, my G, and my B, as you move up, the red is actually blocking the blue physically. So you'll see this color shift happen in the wall. If you go left and right, you don't see it much. And that's a much more like, that's an easier way to shoot. So you'd think, oh, well, I'd rather do like a cluster where like it's all sort of evenly, but you'll end up kind of being in a situation where there's no really great angle other than just dead on. So like just the fact that like something as benign as like how these tiny little LEDs are can like really ruin your day. Like I've definitely been on, scene setups where you look up and you go, oh, these all need to be flipped 90 degrees or something like that for the shot, right? And sometimes and a lot of times, it could be lack of planning, or it could just be, hey, we're trying something new, and it's sort of like one of the many unintended, consequences to a choice that you didn't see down the road. So
Yeah, you got to kind of know what's there and plan for it, and
yeah,
plan for what works about it and what the limitations are. I mean, it's everything that, what Zach's describing, how that affects the sensor of a camera and the lens of the camera,
yeah,
and artifacts in that way. Obviously distance to certain types of tiles, like they're, based on the pixel pitch, you can get closer or further. Depth of field will affect, your moire.
yep.
And then even physically, like how is it load bearing on the ceiling? Can you use the rigging to put practical lights or effects in or stunt in? All the things. Can you punch things through a wall or not? All these things that you would have to plan for as part of the fact that it's actual physical production.
Yeah, I didn't think about the pixel direction. This is the kind of geeky stuff that
It's
I
a good
love,
one,
by the way.
right?
So I'm excited
Yeah.
about that. But yeah, I mean, I did think about moire. I did think about brightness. Like, what is the different LED
Yeah.
walls have different brightnesses that they can do. And okay, this is an interesting one. So don't treat this like visual effects. What do you mean by that? And I kind of get it, but I'd love to have a better understanding of this.
It's practical production, right? You have the director, the DP. There's people on the set. There's going to be a certain amount of planning that has to happen the way you would for physical production, whereas you can kind of sort of, not that we loved it, but people put off things to, we'll deal with it in post. Visual effects will just fix it. You can't really do that. You kind of have to plan ahead for not just the text phase, as far as planning your shots. There's the color pipeline, there's getting the assets built, there's making sure they work inside that environment, making sure the DP knows what the set deck people are doing as they're physically building stuff out. And again, that depends on the stage, how high you need to go to marry with the LED walls. But there's certainly a lot more practical production planning that needs to happen than you would do if it were, going to be done in post visual effects style.
A real-time environment allows you to theoretically touch every part of the asset, right? Does not mean you should, because like there's a thing where you can go down a rabbit hole where someone's like adjusting rocks in virtual reality because it's cool, and it's like it's out of focus, man. Like, why are we even
Oh
like
God.
looking at this? And so like one of the comparisons I give people is imagine you were doing a shoot in a forest, right? And so you go in and imagine if you went in there and you didn't do any scouting, so you just start trying to set up shots, and then you had trees that weren't quite working with your framing. You kind of have two choices. Like you can either do nothing and work around it, or you can start cutting down trees, and then locations starts to have starts to get very angry very quickly. But, as you do on like a location shoot normally is you would say like, okay, we kind of know we have like this clearing, we might need to move some trees. So let's maybe bring in some fake trees to supplement the real ones. So we have ones that we know we can move, right? To make the framing work and stuff like that. And you kind of start talking to your art department or your VAD or your DP about like, what areas of this environment do we think we're going to need to manipulate on the day to achieve the shots versus what are things that can kind of be, for lack of a better term, baked in.
I think, getting the art department, the people who've created assets for virtual production work, talking to the practical art department about what's possible and not possible and what's flexible and not flexible early on is really important.
Or even as simple as stuff as what color dirt are you using?
Yeah, we got to marry this stuff with the painted tree that you're going to have in the volume practically made. Yes.
Yeah. So just
we have examples of that.
So just people understand when we say VAD, we are actually talking about the virtual art department. So what you're doing is you're talking about the people that make the physical props or the physical sets, combining with the people who are making the virtual sets, so that the color of the dirt on the ground matches the color of the dirt in the virtual department.
Yes, right? And the people who are really defining the look of it, the lighting, the color palette, the style.
Okay, next one you talked about was don't expect it to be cheaper. That's a good one to talk about.
Yeah, this is a delicate one.
I think there was a lot of talk about virtual production because there's less people traveling. You can do more in camera. You can have less shoot days. I've heard a lot of different ways that it's been sliced, that it could be cheaper. I always think of it like when we talked about how rendering will get faster, but renders won't get faster because we'll
just throw more stuff at it. Yeah.
Right. And I feel like, so I do think there are efficiencies with the right planning and the right types of projects, the right things on the volume, you can definitely gain efficiencies. I think you can also gain more complexity. You can get richer things on the screen as a result.
I think the big thing with talking about the not necessarily cheaper is like with efficiencies, there can be cost savings and things like that. But the big important takeaway from this is don't treat it as a one-to-one. Don't say that like, for every X amount of virtual production I save X amount of dollars. Like the equation to do that is way too complex and based on so many unknowns to ever really get it. Because like you're talking about the difference between going to like a location potentially real. So like there's the cost of the honeypots, there's the cost of the hotels, like, and there's no real good like way to like do that is repeatable, right? In the way that you can say like by adding an LED wall, X will happen. And if you can get out of that thinking and just think more about like, how can I make this shoot more efficient overall? And you look at it through that lens, I think that's where the actual value is more like apparent.
Yeah, I think, I've heard this, like how many dollars in compositing can I put towards in volume, in camera VFX? And there's no guarantee that you're going to final a shot, and there's almost a guarantee you won't on the set. So it's a different way of thinking about the work. What you can imagine is that you can get through 3 or 4 environments in a week on a volume if you plan it right and prep it right, and you can condense maybe a talent schedule that saves you money in a different bucket. So it is a really a rethinking of how budgeting and planning happens between production and post-production.
Yeah.
Another good one I think you guys said, because I used to be doing a lot of CG lighting and I have a love of photography, is this don't light this don't light it completely with the LED volume.
Yeah, if you're not careful, you can actually run into the same problem you have with green screen, right? Because like bad green screen, there's so much, you're either getting so much bleed or there's so much obvious separation from the subject to the thing behind that there's no tie-in, right? And so the thing to understand is that while you may think, okay, if the LED wraps all around me, I'm getting all those cool reflections and there is some like soft light there. Like there's no hard light source there. Like LED wall will just be the softest thing ever all the time. And so like all the shaping you do to enhance that experience, like you need additional
Yeah,
tools.
you definitely want it for shaping. And there's also, and this is a known thing, the chromaticities of the LEDs are not what you can
Yeah.
get on a camera, right? Sensor. So
Yeah.
or in practical lighting. And so you're needing to, even with the best environments, you still need to add some amount of the spectrum back in to get it in camera, to get the look that you're wanting. And certainly skin tones suffer the most, but there's a whole area of the spectrum that you kind of need to reintroduce in order to get it in camera.
Which in modern LED like lighting fixtures, they have done like huge stuff to address, right? Everything from having RGB AW to like phosphorus ignited, excited like pieces of plastic and stuff like that. So like there's all these things, and like the the dream is to use that technology and make a wall out of it. The challenge is that the people making the walls are like, why should this be a lighting element? I just need
Yeah,
to
it's
put it on
very
the side of
expensive.
a building sort of thing.
Right.
So
So, but it's not such a bad thing. I know use practical lights. They look good. People like to use them.
Okay. Do plan for testing ahead of your shoot. Of course, this makes sense. But what are some of the things that people should plan for before they shoot?
I was going to say, to jump off the lighting thing real quick, just to kind of skip around, is that like you really need to plan those setups with your practical lights, because like spill is definitely a thing. And like, while the LED wall may be projecting the image of an open sky and open space, if a light hits it, it will light the plastic of the LED wall, and it will suddenly be apparent that that is a solid object rather than, open air. So
Yeah.
from a planning point of view, that's a huge thing.
And you definitely want to test your camera.
Yes.
You want to test it for your color workflow. You also want to test your lenses, because looking at what you capture through frustum from a 3D environment may surprise you as you start to move the camera around. It's good to know, that you're ready to go in that way. Another piece is around set integration. It may feel like it's a lot closer than you think. You've used the right palette color and everything, and then when you look at it through camera, there's work to do there to bring those things closer together. That the scenes load, yes, that they run at rate.
Yeah. So really quickly on the scene load aspect, it's interesting because from a if you're in a 2D playback world, right? Since it's a completely rendered piece of content, the engine, which wouldn't necessarily, I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole whether it's real time or not, because it kind of depends on what you're using. But if you used a pre-rendered plate and we're playing it back, what will tend to happen is the relationship between the frame rate of the playback and the frame rate of the output of that machine will be more fixed. Like you'll either be dropping frames or you won't, and that kind of won't be in between unless you start adding extra like filters and stuff to it. In a game engine or real-time engine type of workflow, the output from the render machine is going to be locked so it can be in sync with the rest of what's going on, but the frame rate of the playback of the scene might be all over the place. And so you need to make sure that your like floor, so the lowest frame rate you'll ever drop down to, never goes under what you're supposed to be outputting, because that's when you'll see stuff really start to kind of break.
I think a high level takeaway, anything related to syncing and frame rate and phasing, that if you're depending on what your plan is, that you're testing it through the entire pipeline.
Yeah, for sure. And just, I think as a general rule of thumb, you need to go into it knowing that if you're having LED walls and you're really trying to get everything kind of tied together, you're essentially creating almost a mini broadcast engineering system. And like, it's worth calling that out, because broadcast cameras and cinema cameras, while similar, have some very specific differences in terms of how they talk to each other and how they talk to larger systems. Because for a cinema camera, it can kind of be a bit more on an island, right? Just by the nature of how they've been developed. So it's just worth keeping all that in mind, because, you're stepping into a slightly different environment when you kind of go down this route.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so finally, and I think this is sort of related to don't treat this like a visual effect. Don't expect there to be no post.
I mean, with the right amount of planning, budgeting, talent, aligning of the stars, you can do amazing things on a volume. But I wouldn't promise anyone that you're not going to do any post production. And why wouldn't you? I mean, in the end of the day, you want to polish this. You want it to be as beautiful as possible. So planning that you may still want to go to post on some of this is a reasonable thing.
Right.
Yeah. We always talk about that these techniques, like the better way to think about it is that you can make hard VFX shots, medium VFX shots, easy ones, and then you can capture some portion of the easy ones in camera, or you may have to do a little bit of touch up. But like, again, it's always on a spectrum. And anytime you're hearing someone talk about absolutes with this stuff in terms of what you can and cannot do, you should at least be wary. And I'm not saying, because there are absolutes to this, like there are rules to some of the physics involved, but like, I think the thing to realize, if you go into this kind of with the mentality that everything's on a sliding scale, you will find yourself disappointed less.
Right.
And you'll be more.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the project, right?
Yeah.
If you've got a lot of CG animation stunts and things going on, it's going to be a smaller percentage. If you're in a cockpit and it's two people talking for 90 minutes, you might be able to do the entire thing on a volume.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, cool. Well, guys, thank you so much. These have been great tips. I really hope this is going to help people figure out things and sort of understand the amazing abilities they have and the things that they can do inside of volumes, and get like you said, it's not necessarily a magic bullet, but it's definitely a super big advance in the industry and filmmaking that we can all get a better understanding of. So thank you guys so much.
Yeah, and the more people test and play, and the more we'll all learn. But yeah,
yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks to Kristen.
Great.